Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. Sebastian Junger had faced death many times before. As a war correspondent, he'd been on the front lines in Afghanistan. He'd come face-to-face with militants in the Niger Delta when one of them pointed at him and said, "I'm going to kill you." But it wasn't until June of 2020 that Sebastian Junger came to truly understand what it meant to face mortality. He and his family were living in rural Massachusetts. A pain in his stomach had been nagging him for months, and then one day, ignoring that pain became impossible. He writes about what happened next in his new book, In My Time of Dying, how I came face to face with the idea of an afterlife. Sebastian Junger, good morning.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you.
It's good to have you here. On that day, when you and your wife realized something was very wrong, what happened?
We had a little bit of babysitting time, and so we went off to it's a very remote area of Massachusetts with no cell phone service. It's an old house at the end of a dead-end dirt road. And we went even further out into the woods to a little cabin that's even more remote. And in mid-sentence, I felt this pain flashed through my abdomen, like unlike anything I'd ever felt. And I eventually stood up to try to walk it out. I thought it was indigestion, and I almost fell over. My blood pressure was tanking. What I didn't know was that I had a ruptured artery in my abdomen. I had internal hemorrhage, which can be really deadly. And it was a random freak thing. I had a weak spot in the artery, and it developed an aneurysm over the course of my lifetime, and it chose that moment to rupture. And we lived at an hour from the nearest medical care, and it turns out I was losing a pint of blood every 10 or 15 minutes. And there's 10 pints of blood in the human body. I was literally a human hourglass, sort of racing for the hospital. But I knew none of this. I had no idea I was dying. I knew something was quite wrong, but it never crossed my mind that I was actually dying. Your
wife had the sense that you were dying. You looked at her, and she thought you were dying.
Yeah, I said, honey, I'm going to need help. Like, I don't understand what's happening. And she dragged me out of the woods, and we managed to get one bar of cell phone service and call the emergency services. And then she held my hand while she watched me go in and out of consciousness. And every time I left consciousness, she thought, he's not coming back. And then at one point I said, I'm going blind. And indeed, this electric white had filled the sky and it was blocking out the trees and the house and everything around me, and eventually blocked everything out I couldn't see. And I was experiencing classic symptoms of extreme blood loss. So the bleeding was going directly into my abdomen. Like if I was stabbed in the stomach, you would bleed out the wound. There'd be blood all over the place. But with an internal hemorrhage, there's no blood, but you are still losing blood. And that's the critical state I was in when the ambulance arrived.
You get to the hospital, and as you're being wheeled into the hospital, doctors see you as you go by their office, and they had a reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of rallied during the trip in the ambulance. The body goes into compensatory shock and sort of like reboots a little bit. So I was sort of feeling okay. And as soon as we got to the hospital an hour later, I went off a cliff. Eventually, the body fails. You can't, if you lose enough blood, eventually your body gives up. And that's what happened right when I hit the hospital. And also all the doctors knew I had all the symptoms of extreme blood loss, low blood volume. They rushed me into a trauma bay. They knew immediately what it was. They just didn't know where the rupture was. Like, again, if I'd been stabbed in the stomach, they would know where the problem was. They would know, in a sense, where to put their finger to plug the leak. But with an internal hemorrhage, it's anyone's guess, and they can put you in a scanner, and your abdomen's filled with blood from the rupture, and so it's they just can't, it's very hard to tell where the problem is, and that's why it's so deadly. They rushed me to the trauma bay, and a doctor started putting a large gauge needle through my neck into my jugular to transfuse me. And as he was prepping the area, and again, I had no idea that I was dying. And I should say at this point, I'm an atheist. I'm a lifelong atheist and a rationalist. My father was a physicist and an atheist. Just, it's important to know those things because of what I'm about to say. So while I'm lying in the trauma bay and they're prepping my neck, I sensed this black void open up underneath me, this infinitely deep black hole. And I'm getting pulled into it. And I don't want to go. And I'm desperate to not go because I have this sense, I'm like a wounded animal. Like I just had this sense, instinct that if you go in there, you're not coming back out. And right as I was struggling with that, and they were working on my neck, and I was struggling to not go into the pit, my dead father appeared above me in this sort of intense sort of energy form. It's really hard to describe, but he was right there above me and to my left, and he was communicating to me, "It's okay. You don't have to fight it. You can come with me. I'll take care of you." And I was horrified. In my mind, I'm like, "Dad, you're dead. I'm alive. I'm not going anywhere with you." Like I was almost offended by the suggestion. And I said to the doctor, "You got to hurry. You're losing me right now. I'm going." I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I was outbound and that I was not coming back.
If you had gone into that pit, that purest black pit, or followed your father, you'd be dead.
Well, I mean, who knows, right? I mean, I know someone. So NDEs, as they're called, near-death experiences, are quite common, and seeing a loved one there to receive you is a very, very common thing with people who are atheists like myself, or people who don't even know they're dying. Sometimes the dead person is someone that the dying person didn't know had died, right? Like there's quite a mystery around it, and I say that as a rationalist and a secular person. I talked to someone who actually did get pulled into the pit, and she said that it was absolutely terrifying. It was this sort of free fall in pure blackness without any reference points. And but she was saved. I mean, the doctors got her back. My heart never stopped. People can be brought back from cardiac arrest. All kinds of miracles can happen. So I don't know what would have happened, but I do know that when I was there, I was horrified by the idea of dying. It was not the sort of welcome thing that some people say. And for them, maybe it was, but for me, it was absolutely appalling.
Can we just go back to you lying on that table as the doctors are trying to figure out how to save you? They're scrambling, you're losing blood. It's unclear if they're going to be able to get to what's going on in time. And you're conscious through some of this, kind of aware of what's going on, and then you do some reconstruction after and speaking with them. But you describe there's a look between two of the surgeons. Can you describe what was going on there?
Yeah, the look, as I came to think of it. Yeah, so, I was conscious for quite a lot of the next 6 hours. They couldn't sedate me because my vital signs were so low. They brought me in there, and I was, my blood pressure was 60/40, which is like you're running on fumes, basically. So I was in incredible pain and in my back. And so they stabilized me with a blood transfusion. I needed 10 units of blood, basically a whole person's worth of blood.
This is the code crimson that they have to call in the hospital.
Yeah, they called what's called a code crimson, which is basically all the blood resources rush to the emergency room, emergency department, and they start pumping someone full of blood. Often people need 1 unit or 2 units. And by the way, let me just stop and say, please donate blood, everybody. Like, I'm alive because of it. There are people that you love who are alive because of it. We all must donate blood, but so I needed 10 units, right? But they stabilized me, and that allowed me to go into the interventional radiology suite, which is a branch of medicine that a lot of people don't know about. I certainly didn't. What they do is they use they navigate the body with catheters. They don't slice open your belly and try to find the leaking artery, right? They punch a hole into your femoral artery in your right groin, and they thread a catheter, a flexible tube or wire, up through your venous system, all the way through, and they can take turns, and they can double back, and they can do almost anything, and they just sort of by remote control, they keep pushing this wire through your vascular system until they've navigated to the point where they need to put in a stent or repair something, or in my case, embolize the rupture, plug the rupture so it stops leaking, stops bleeding. And so they tried and tried, and because I have such a strange vasculature, it's a freak. Basically what's wrong with me is kind of a freak random thing, right? It's not a product of poor health or whatever. It's an anatomical anomaly, right? So they couldn't get the catheter to where to the bleed, and which means that they had to send me into the OR and basically open me up and hope that they could root around amongst my organs and find the bleed before I bled out. Right then, you're really racing the clock, and the outcome of that is abysmal. I mean, the survival rate is abysmal. It's really battlefield surgery, basically, a last ditch. And so they got to, I remember watching them. At one point, the doctor shrugged, the interventional radiologist shrugged and was like, "We did all we could. Like, it's not working." And the other doctor nodded. And I just couldn't believe what I'd seen. I was watching my doctors give up, right? That's what I thought. And they were amazing doctors, by the way. I mean, this is through the perspective of a very unwell person, right? But I couldn't believe they were like shrugged, like, what do we do now? And nothing's worked. And then the interventional radiologist, Dr. Phil Dombrowski in Massachusetts, he said, why don't we go through his left wrist? And so it was sort of brilliant counterintuitive thinking, and that allowed him a different angle of attack. And he had to be incredibly patient and detailed and skilled. Another doctor said to me that maybe only 5% of all the interventional radiologists in the world would have thought of this and could have pulled it off.
Somebody compares it to like a salmon swimming upstream.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I would, had Dr. Dombrowski not been in that 5%, I'd probably be dead. Like, I'm just incredibly lucky. And they eventually embolized it and carted me off to the ICU. I got to hold my wife's hand for a moment on the way through. And, my poor wife went through the whole thing knowing that her husband very, very possibly was going to die. And we had 2 young kids, a little 3-year-old girl, and a 6-month-old baby girl. And, she went through a hell that was far worse than what I went through.
The morning after, the nurse in the ICU tells you, you almost died last night. In fact, nobody can believe that you're alive. Why do you think you survived?
I survived because according to the doctor, I'm an athlete. I have a strong, healthy heart. I sustained damage to myself. I sustained a level of blood loss that kills many people. And I gave the doctors something to work with. And those doctors were extraordinary, right? I had amazing, and this was a small hospital in Massachusetts. In some ways, they had no business being there. They were like big city doctors at a top hospital, except at this tiny little place. And they saved my life, and 10 anonymous donors who gave their blood at some point, and that blood was pumped into my veins and kept me alive.
Do you think there's something else that's going on? The nurse also says, when she says that you should be dead right now, she says, instead of thinking of it as something scary, try to think of it as something sacred.
Yeah, and I don't know what she meant by that. I can't know her mind, but what she said was very useful to me. It was terrifying to me to get this news in the ICU that I'd almost died, and it was almost paralyzing. And when she said, think about it like something sacred, I consider the word sacred to mean anything that has value, anything that helps myself or other people live with more dignity, with more courage, with more love, with less fear. Any information, any process that enables all of us to do that a little bit better is sacred, right? I'm an atheist. That's a secular meaning for that beautiful word. And that's the meaning that I give it. So I thought, okay, I've gone to front lines my whole life. I was blown up by, a roadside bomb. I had bullets hit next to my head. I was threatened with execution by a rebel group. I mean, all kinds of things. And I've come back from those sort of liminal edge places with information for everyone else. So like, okay, this is what's going on in the world. What are we going to do, right? And I give you the information, you make the decisions, but that's the proper role of journalism. And for me, that's sort of a sacred task, right? Like we're all helping things go a little bit better, maybe. So I realized I went to the ultimate front line. When I almost died, I went to the front line of my own mortality, and I looked over the edge into the abyss, and I was allowed to come back. What information did I come back with? Did I come back with any sacred information that could help me or others live more dignified, more courageous, more loving lives?
I was going to say,
that's the meaning.
Psychologically, what does something like that do to you? You worry about this thing kind of following you around like a ghastly pet, the fact that you nearly died and you survived. What does it do to you when, as you say, you peer over that edge?
Well, I didn't know this, but it's very, very common for people who nearly die in medical incidents like this to have a very, very hard time adjusting afterwards, incredibly anxious and eventually incredibly depressed. Both of those things happened to me. And specifically what people struggle with, what I struggled with, was the terrifying idea that I did die, that I actually did die, and that I'm now a spirit, I'm a ghost, and I'm just imagining that I'm here and that my family, my children, my wife are interacting with me.
What do you mean? What do you mean that you died and that you're a ghost?
Yeah. I wasn't convinced that I had made it. And I worried that everything that followed from the hospital was a kind of dying hallucination. And we know that the brain produces very strange visions when people die. And I had had a dream the night prior that I had died. And this is what really unnerved me, that I had died and that I was a spirit. I was a ghost and I was hovering above my family. And I had no reason to think that within a day I would be dying. Like, I just didn't know that, right? But I had a dream that I had died and I was hovering above my family and they were grieving and I couldn't reach them. They couldn't hear me. They couldn't see me. And I was made to understand that it was too late. I died and it was over. And so when I got home, instead of it being a sort of big joyful party, I was incredibly sorrowful. I felt like I'd never be the same again. I'd seen death and now I couldn't get rid of it. And I was seized with this fear that I actually wasn't here. And I know it sounds crazy and neurotic. I take some comfort in the fact that many, many other people have the same reaction. So who knew? But that does seem to be what these things do to people.
This book is divided into two parts, what and if. And the what is you describing what happened to you. The if is that. A lot of rumination on what you'd been through and what happens when other people have these sort of near-death experiences. And you treat it in many ways like a journalistic exercise. We learn about a number of people who have been to that brink. Who was Tyler Carroll, and what did you learn from Tyler Carroll?
Yeah, so I did a whole deep dive on NDEs, near-death experiences, because it turns out they're quite common. And I was trying to find some comfort maybe in the experiences of other people, like, oh, I'm just like everyone else, no problem. And Tyler Carroll was a soldier, the American soldier that I met, a veteran, who had been badly wounded in combat, and he had actually almost bled out just like me. And I'd been with American soldiers quite a lot in Afghanistan. I connected to him, on that level, and I interviewed him. And his experience was absolutely extraordinary. And he said, as he was dying, all of a sudden, and he was a medic, so when he was going in and out of consciousness, he was going in and out of treating another wounded soldier and then passing out and then waking up and going back to treating him again. And he was going in and out of being a functional medic, which is kind of extraordinary. But at any rate, as he reached the threshold like I did, he had this extraordinary experience, this overwhelming feeling of love and of seeing his entire existence, his entire life before him simultaneously, every moment in it before him to behold in one moment simultaneously. And it was an absolutely overwhelming feeling. And so I talk about him in the book because he's another example of a common reaction to almost dying.
Sebastian, you were trying to process what had happened to you, and you start talking to other people about their near-death experiences, or NDEs as you call them. How do you go from that to thinking about quantum physics?
Well, there's two camps when it comes to NDEs, and there are a lot of very highly credentialed people, very smart people, who take the thousands of accounts of NDEs that people have that have been reported as evidence, not proof of, but evidence of some kind of afterlife, right? And I use the words in quotes, right? I don't even quite sure what people mean by afterlife, but that there's some kind of post-death existence. And then there's other equally smart people who are like, nonsense, like, we understand the neurochemistry of this. It's all about the sort of the last moments of the dying brain and seizures, and there are mechanistic explanations for all of these visions. And as a rationalist, I was going with the rationalists, right? I mean, they're killjoys, but they're killjoys that make sense, and I find a certain comfort in their logic. Except there was one thing that they just couldn't quite understand. Like, we know that if you give a room full of people LSD, they will all hallucinate. We know that, and we know why. But they will not all hallucinate the same thing. And one of the strange things about people who almost die, like I did, is that many, many of them see the dead, like the dead come to welcome them. And it's very hard to explain the consistency of the visions with a just standard neurochemistry explanation. So it occurred to me that there are also in this odd world of what is life, what is death, what is consciousness. The discussions in this odd world have drifted towards quantum physics. And there are some very credible ideas that are not provable, but not disprovable either, that there might be a post-death reality for the individual at the quantum level, which is to say at the subatomic level. And one of the mysteries of subatomic physics is that when you observe subatomic particles, like a photon, when you observe them, they act differently than if you don't observe them. And when you don't observe them, the photon is in all possible places at once and as a waveform. And then when you observe it, when a conscious mind observes the photon through optics, obviously through a device, all of a sudden the photon has to pick a spot, and it becomes real in the sense that we mean the word real. And so one of the theories is that the consciousness itself is a part of the physical universe, just like gravity is, and it suffuses everything. And that without it, nothing would exist. The universe would be one massive waveform of all potentialities, all possibilities, and that there's something in that mystery that might apply to a post-death existence that continues at a quantum level, and we just don't and maybe can't ever understand it.
Does something like that give you, I mean, it kind of melts your brain a little bit thinking of it, but does it give you some degree of comfort in thinking about what happens in death?
It did a little bit. And I had gone through my life thinking, okay, well, we're biological beings, and when we die, that's it. But we won't know that that's it because we're biological beings and we're dead. And so there's no real suffering there. And it makes death seem scary unless you're in a huge amount of pain or very, very old and sort of done with the whole thing. But the alternative to that, as I've been exposed to it, is religion, right? And what I found, I mean, look, I'm as scared as everybody else, right, of the big darkness. And what I found was that what religion was proposing, like, look, there's this sort of benevolent father figure, this God, with a, supposedly with a beard and, whatever, but that sort of figure, this sort of Christian figure of a creator God. And he is there. And because he's there, you will live forever. You'll live for eternity. Don't worry about it. And if I could have gone for that, I would have, right? But it just didn't seem credible. And worse than that, there didn't seem to be any evidence of it whatsoever, right? I mean, like, just give me one sign, like just something. And the standard evidence is, I mean, when push comes to shove, believers will say, well, the fact that the universe exists, this complex mechanism exists in the first place, proves that something had to have created it, and that's God. And, that's the fallacy of the first cause, and it doesn't really work. But so basically there was no salvation in the direction of God. I'm still an atheist, right? But what the quantum inquiry allowed me to do was what many of the physicists did, such as Schrödinger, one of the pioneers of quantum physics. He came to the belief that there was a universal consciousness, that consciousness was part of the colossus of existence. And it was a part of the very fiber of the material world at the subatomic level. And that when you die, you return to that enormous collective consciousness. And so there is something comforting there. And I got to say, it's also comforting to not have to dread the possibility of being conscious for eternity with no possibility of exit, whether you're in pain or whatever, or just bored. That's what the afterlife people are proposing. And I frankly find that absolutely terrifying.
Do you think a lot about the powers of the universe? I mean, you write a lot about in the book about your friend Tim Hetherington, the British photojournalist, and he was killed on a trip that you were supposed to be on in many ways, right? And you didn't go. And while he was there, you were in a bike crash or something, and you say that you survived, but you'd given the universe the slip, and so the universe had to take him. Do you believe that?
No, I don't. I don't on a literal sense. But what I realized that there are stories and there are explanations. And religion is a story, and it's a story that we come up with to make us able to emotionally navigate life, which is painful and confusing and even terrifying, right? And then there's the explanations that the scientists are after about, well, how does all this stuff work, right? And so I was in a moment of extreme pain. And when you lose someone, if you're in combat with someone and they die in a car accident, no problem, right? You just grieve them. And if someone, a friend of yours, dies in combat, but you were never in combat with them, likewise, that was their deal. But if you're in combat with another man and then he dies in combat, it's your fault. And I felt this absolutely crushing grief and guilt and shame that it wasn't me, that it was him. It was supposed to be me, and it wasn't, and he paid the price for my survival. And I know that didn't make sense in rational terms, but it felt that way. And eventually, even the most dogged atheist, like the most dogged rationalist, like your feelings will be heard, right? Like even if they make no sense at all. And likewise, the feelings of someone else will be heard. You can't just say, go away. And that was just an emotional process that I went through.
How are you different now, do you think? You should be dead. And you're not. And I had this conversation with Salman Rushdie recently, who also should be dead, as he said. He was stabbed a dozen plus times and somehow survived. And he says in many ways that he's different in ways that surprise him. How are you different now?
Well, one of the things that has affected all this is that I have very young children, right? I had my first daughter at age 55, and now I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so for me, dying is absolutely mortifying. It's unthinkable because of the pain I would cause them, right? And that really has sort of overridden some of my own personal feelings about it. And so the flip side of that coin is that I'm alive, and that all of our days and hours are precious, even if they don't feel that way. I sort of woke up. Right. I woke up to the fact that I'm here and you're here. We're all here. The tree is here. Like the car is here. And it's weird because you have to ignore all that stuff in order to function, in order to be here. But in ignoring all that stuff, you lose the point of it all. And so, what happened to me, I think, is a little bit similar to, and I didn't know this story until after I finished the book, but it's quite a wonderful story. The Russian writer Dostoevsky suffered a mock execution in his 20s. He was a political radical. He sat around with his buddies talking about outrageous ideas like freeing the serfs and things like that. And they eventually got picked up by the police and thrown in prison for 8 months. It wasn't a particularly serious crime, so they didn't give much thought to it. And they eventually let him out of prison after 8 months and loaded them into a wagon to be taken presumably to the courthouse to be released to their families, et cetera, et cetera. And instead, they were driven to a city square and tied to posts, and a firing squad was arrayed in front of them. So these young men were in their 20s, and they had just mere minutes to go from, oh, I'm going to see my family, to, oh my God, I'm going to be dead in a few minutes. I mean, a hallucinatory moment, right? And so what Dostoevsky said was that as he was waiting for the commands to fire, the rifles leveled, and then a rider galloped into the square and said, the Tsar forgives them, right? So that's how it ended. But in those moments, he said he saw sunlight glinting off a church steeple, and he realized, well, in just moments, I'm going to be part of the sunlight. I'm going to be part of all things. And then if I should somehow survive this, I'm going to turn every moment into an eternity. And, that's a perception of reality that is pretty close to a drug trip, right? I mean, that's almost hallucinatory in its reverence for existence. And so I think that I was able to get to that place a lot more easily. And then when you do that, all of a sudden, you're not checking your stupid phone all the time, right? You're not like wasting your time in being hateful to people. You're focusing on like love and gratitude. And I know those are sort of Christian terms, but they're perfectly good secular expressions for them as well. And it I would say it matured me. It brought me to a sort of final maturity that is really what life is about.
This is a remarkable book. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about it. I'm glad you're doing okay now.
Yeah, I'm fine.
You're alive, which is good.
I'm alive. Yeah, we're all alive. Yeah, it's medically I'm fine, and I even overcame my psychological struggles. So I'm good.
It's really something. Sebastian, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Sebastian Junger is an author, journalist, and documentary filmmaker. His new book is called In My Time of Dying: How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife.